I have read that where authorities were particularly aggrieved by a person who was accused of witchcraft or heresy, that they would build the stake from fresh branches and twigs rather than dry brittle ones. The reason? Because it took longer to burn and that person would suffer far more. Now in this video we are going to be talking about James I of England, James VI of Scotland, and how his particular story of witchcraft helps to fan the flames of witchcraft all the way from Scotland to England and to Salem. And then beyond that, we're going to be talking about the origins of hysteria about witchcraft, Malleus Maleficarum, and how that all starts. Let's do the intro. Welcome back to the channel for another week, guys. I thought we'd do a fireside chat today because we're doing witches. It's the autumn, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. I'm DrLauren-Jane. I'm a medical doctor, ex-theologian, and today we're going to be talking about that most fascinating of subjects, witches, and we're going to be looking at how James I hooks into this. Now, James I, a lot can be said about James I. Now, you are going to see my cats walking in and out. It's one of the reasons I want to film here, actually. Now, a lot can be said about James I. Even his enemies would all agree that he was a very, very intelligent man. As a child, his kind of hobbies were translating things from Latin into French, into English. By the time he was an adult, he wanted to write treatises on all kinds of things, from religious issues to the dangers of nicotine. Yes, that's right. He was writing treatises on nicotine 400 years ago. In this period, witchcraft is kind of the AI of the day. It's the hot topic. Any self-respecting thinker who's going to be interested in witchcraft, and James certainly is, but he has a personal reason for being interested in this. Now, James is not actually James I of England at this point. He's James VI of Scotland. His mother is Mary, Queen of Scots, and eventually he is the one that will take the throne from Elizabeth. That's right, Henry VIII's daughter. But at the moment, he is not yet King of England, but he is about to be married, and that is where things are going to go wrong for the hundreds of people that are later going to be burned at the stake. In August of 1589, James is preparing to be married to Princess Anne of Denmark. Now on the 5th of September, her fleet sets off. She's under the care of Admiral Peter Monk. He is the most senior officer in the Danish Navy. Now picture it, her flagship ahead of a fleet of ships, a pageant planned in Scotland. Maybe if she'd got there would have been no Salem witch trials, who knows, okay? When the fleet hits the North Sea, everything goes wrong. There is a tremendous storm which apparently ranges all the way from Norway to Britain, and the fleet is scattered. Now, the storm is so significant that one of these ships ends up on the floor of the Forth of the Firth, which is next to Scotland. And James is at Craigsmillar Castle. He's going out of his mind. He can obviously see the storm. He puts the nation of Scotland on a spiritual fast. He's so worried about her. Now, as the skies clear, the good news does get through, and it has not ended up on the bottom of the sea. She's fine. She's been blown kind of somewhere far away. She ends up in Oslo, but she is not at the bottom of the sea, which is fantastic. She ends up sheltering in a cottage, and then she makes her way on land to Oslo. Now, James ends the fast and he praises God. She's fine. Excellent. Now, James shall go to her. So he packs all of his lords and ladies and a load of acrobats, and they set sail for Oslo. Now, they have a lavish ceremony, which is apparently ruined only by the deaths of 4 African dancers who James makes dance naked in the snow. So this should tell you what kind of guy he is. Okay, so they set off for Copenhagen on their honeymoon. Everyone is in great spirits. At the moment, kind of maybe people are thinking that this storm is a bit of a coincidence. There are storms in the North Sea. James is having the time of his life, and they're not actually planning to go back to Scotland until the spring. And when they do, they're going to go through the Skagerrak Channel again and into the North Sea. Now, Admiral Monk, remember him, it looks like his reputation has been on the line, because he's telling anyone who will listen that witches are the reason that they got into this storm in the North Sea. Now, this is going to be important later on. It seems like at the moment James is just kind of worked up in enjoying his own marriage festivities. So we have our newlyweds, we have the fleet, we are sailing back to Scotland. What could possibly go wrong? And a storm hits. Now, one storm, coincidence. 2 storms, witches. Over in Copenhagen, 6 women admit to being witches and having cursed Anne's ship. Now, we don't know why they confessed. Presumably they've been tortured. They haven't just offered this information. That seems very unlikely. Now, around the same time, a woman called Malleus Duncan, who's living just outside of Edinburgh, has also been accused of witchcraft because unfortunately she is someone who ministers to the sick, and these are always people who are regarded with mistrust in this time period. Now, she's given the thumbscrews, and under torture she names a couple of other people, and she also admits that she's a witch. James is paranoid, not without reason. Obviously, we know the kind of world that James lives in. We know that there are people who are plotting against him, and James suspects that these people who are plotting against him might well be using witches to try and undermine his authority. Now, James, paranoid with a restless mind, takes a personal interest in Malleus Duncan's case. If you're accused, it is never good news for you where authorities deviate from the known process. And that is exactly what James does. So even, Scotland all these time ago, it has a process for dealing with people that are accused of witchcraft. James changes all that. So he assembles a panel and the women are questioned, and he takes great delight in learning the ins and outs of demonology associated with this case. He learns, he said, that the devil leaves marks on women by licking them. This comes from Malleus Maleficarum. We'll be going through that in a bit. And so what they do is they want to apply this test to see if Malleus has been licked anywhere, if she has a witch mark. This is from the Malleus Maleficarum, but this has never been seen in Britain before. This is landmark because obviously we will see this all the way through England, and we will eventually see this being applied also in Salem later on. So there is a lady called Agnes. She is also accused. So she is an elderly victim, an elderly widow who was once a midwife, and she has a mark on her vagina. She's accused of having filled a cat with human body parts, sank it, and then when it returned to land, she drowned it. And this apparently is what brought the Queen's ship to it wasn't the Queen's ship that went down, was it? But this is what affected the Queen's fleet. These witch trials would eventually go on to be known as the North Berwick witch trials. And as time and the investigation went on, more and more outlandish claims were made by the women accused of what they'd done effectively. They all claimed that they'd met at church in North Berwick. And a guy was also included, his name was John Feenan, and he was a local school teacher. He also confessed under torture, but he refused to agree in open court. Now, James, ever the gentle and loving king, made sure that needles were inserted under his fingernails and had his legs crushed and beaten together. So he dies, and Agnes and Malleus are burned with 7 others. It's obviously, with the view of history, a massive injustice, but James is not finished. Now, in 1591, James commissions a council to safeguard Scotland from sorcery, because if anything, we know that this storm has happened. What it has done is brought to James's attention that there are dangerous people in Scotland that are plotting against him and Anne. So he creates this council. Hysteria is just going to rise and rise. Enemies are everywhere, and there is now a weapon to punish them. Now, John Feenan, the school teacher, he's very interesting because he doesn't, in open court, he doesn't confess to being a witch or a sorcerer or whatever, but he does admit to 32 counts of adultery, which might suggest to you the real reason why he's accused in the first place. Now, 6 years after this panel, in 1591, that James commissions, he produces his own treatise on demons called Demonology. This is a king who is really willing to learn and do the dirty work on finding out what witches are up to. Now, a brief summary of what's in this book, because it's very interesting, so it's divided into a couple of books. He basically talks about the difference between necromancy and witchcraft. He talks about the uses of charms, circles, conjurations. He talks about astrology. He talks about devil's contracts with men, comparisons between the miracles of God and the devil. He talks about the difference between biblical proof and imagination or myth. And he talks about the curses and roles of Satan and methods and transportations of Satan, effectively. So all kinds of things which are meant to advise the spiritual person into how to deal with your local witch. Now, in England, there actually isn't a huge amount of hysteria about witches. Now, the English have always regarded this sort of thing differently than their European counterparts on the continent. And some of the hysteria being seen in Europe about witches just isn't seen here yet. Luckily for us in England, James VI is confined to Scotland. What the English need is for Elizabeth to choose a sensible heir when she dies. Oh dear, it's James. Now he is King of England and Scotland. So he becomes James I, he unites England and Scotland, and he brings with him his fervour for killing witches. Now, history has been quite, I'm not going to say unfair, but history has remembered James as being in a fervour about witchcraft. And it is difficult, I will come to a counter argument in a bit, but it is difficult to distance him for that when there is a quote from him saying that he delighted, that's the word he used, he delighted in being involved in the witch trials. So we can't really separate when we talk about the fervour that he brings to England. This is kind of, there's a delight that he is taking, in his own words, there is a delight. So in 1603 he takes the throne and the law changes. Witchcraft is redefined to include communing with spirits. That's important because before this you need a victim to come forward and basically accuse you. You don't need that anymore. So take a moment to imagine how terrifying that is, that you could be hanged because Mrs. Smith down the road saw you communing with spirits, you know? Have you ever upset anyone? Have you got an ex-wife or an ex-boyfriend who really doesn't like you? You really are in danger. Anyone can accuse anyone. Now, 4 out of every 10 are hanged. Reportedly, England's highest ever death rate occurs. Witches would be swimmed, which is obviously when you dunk them to see if they will swim or not, to see if they would drown, or face execution, and people are stripped to look for marks. But there is another side of the story, and James is not completely responsible. Now, hysteria about witchcraft is spreading like wildfire across Europe in this period, so we can't totally blame James for the spread of this because it is happening in other places too. And the last years of Elizabeth's reign also see a really brutal persecution of witches. In 1597, James actually reined in his Scottish Inquisition panel. He feared that they were using the position to execute grudges against particulars. 19 years later, he frees the accused in England when actually having interviewed the accuser himself, he thinks that he's a liar and the person is acquitted. Now, we talked at the beginning about how James was a clever and questioning man, and I think this does show that. He's a man who gets wrapped up in the paranoia and fear of witchcraft when he feels like his wife-to-be is targeted, but as he goes through and he learns, he actually starts to rein back, and I think that's really important to remember when we think about James. This intervention that he makes here actually helps to collapse witchcraft accusations all across the country. Witchcraft trials will never be the same in England ever again after this. But we must remember that the Scottish courts burned over 1,000 people, which is apparently 12 times the number that were burned in England. England's last witch hunt was 1682. A senile woman called Temperance Lloyd, who apparently ate all through her trial because she had no idea what was coming. Now, in the research that I did for this video, I found out that a disproportionate amount of the Puritans who end up inhabiting Massachusetts come from East Anglia and Essex, regions in England where witch trials were most fervent. And we see how England is influenced by James I. Where England grows quiet, the hysteria will continue to spread, and in Salem, more than 200 people would be accused and 25 would die. And in Europe, from the 14th to 17th centuries, tens of thousands of Europeans would die. Most of them would be women. In the second part of this video, we are going to be talking about exactly how we go from the early Christian church, which really doesn't care about witches so much, to tens of thousands of deaths. Now, I mentioned earlier, tantalizingly I hope, that there is a big kind of cultural and mental difference between people on the continent and people in Britain. Now, there's a lot of shared history, obviously because of the Roman conquest, the successive conquests of Britain, there's a lot of shared cultural history and ideology. However, on the continent, there is supreme authority of the church. So canonical and Roman law is king. However, in England, kings are delegating responsibility to local officials. We have jury trial. Now, it's way too simplistic to say one is better than the other. On the continent, your whole legal process is only as fair as your priest and whatever his kind of biases are. In England, you might have a jury, but your prosecutor can sway them and there is no defense. Now, it's easy to look back at Christianity and say Christianity does not like witches. And that's true. We think of the book of Exodus, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, right? But actually, the early Christian church, which is mired in kind of working out its own theology, and it's at its essence, at its purest, really doesn't like the idea of witches. In the 5th century, St. Augustine says that only God has the power to turn a man into a beast, and kind of what he means by that and what he's talking about is that inherently only God has the power to create mischief. if you introduce a witch or a satanic-like being who has power that can challenge your gods, that is fundamentally heretical. So sometimes in the modern day Christian church, we often think of a dualism, good versus evil. Now in the early Christian church, that's very much not the way things are. God is all powerful, he's completely good. And so you really can't have the idea that you have witches and Satan who are a threat to God's authority. That, for Augustine, is a complete heresy. So witches, malevolent spirits, they do exist in early Christianity, but they're thought of being kind of a local, mild nuisance. They cannot challenge God's power or God's authority. So in the early Christian church, and this is interesting when we come to thinking about why witches are persecuted later on, the kind of baseline Catholic theology is that to suggest that a witch is causing problems is actually heretical in itself. There's even a story by a guy called Roger Wendover who tells of Satan helping a nun to fight off a rapist. This is the way that the early church thinks about Satan. But the Catholic Church ends up at war. We have the Crusades going on in the Middle East, and later on we have the Cathars, which are causing a problem for the church in France. Now these are a splinter sect of Christians. Their views are very different. Even today, I might make a different video of them, but their views are very different than what we would consider Christian views today. Now the church really sets to persecuting these people in France. There's a huge massacre at the castle of Carcassonne. But what the church does is, though they do succeed in killing many people, they just kind of splinter them throughout France and Europe. In this period, Lucifer is promoted to the Prince of Darkness. The church needs an enemy, and obviously this prince needs missionaries. Superstitions begin to change. Now in the 13th century, a monk called Thomas Aquinas puts demons under the not yet created microscope. So such creatures are dangerous, they are a real threat. In Paris in 1323, there's an anecdotal story which is really interesting why I wanted to include it. So shepherds noticed two long straws poking out of the ground at a crossroads. And the distant sounds of a meow. So local inquisitors summoned to dig find a chest buried in the ground, and in that is a cat. Okay, this story is apparently true. The local abbey had recently had its coffers stolen, and they'd recruited a magician, and what his plan was basically to bury the cat for 3 days, dig it up, skin it, and then make a hide from its skin and eat the contents of the stomach, and then apparently that meant that they would be able to find their coffers. So inquisitors were not impressed. The monks were incarcerated for life. Those that had been most involved were burned for heresy. We understand why, because obviously we can't use these powers of darkness, and the magician is burned with the cat around its neck. Now, the church is no longer ambivalent to this sort of behaviour. The spirits of darkness have now become somewhat of a challenge to God's authority. So in 1484, something is now changing, something which would haunt Scotland and Europe and Salem all of those years later. Pope Innocent VIII would order 2 Dominican friars, the names of Heinrich Kramer, who is most definitely the power behind the wheel, and another guy called Jacob Sprenger, who it seems is kind of along for the ride. Now these are Dominican friars and they're working in Germany. Now they've been ordered by the Pope to produce a full report on witches. Now, this report is called the Malleus Maleficarum, and you're probably familiar with the term because it pops up on TV shows all the time, they love it. It translates as the hammer of the witches. We've met it before in this video. It's where James gets this idea that Satan would lick a witch and leave a witch mark. Now it's impossible to overstate how monumental this report is for people all across Europe for the next 400 years. Previously, as we discussed, it had been heretical to kind of go along with the idea of witches. Now it is absolutely heretical to deny them. This is a huge theological shift. Now, Kramer is an incredibly complex figure. He certainly hated women, and he has been publicly humiliated during witch trials before. People really don't support him. And when he tries to put a witch on the stand, there is a lady who I'm going to make a different video about. Her name is Helena Schuberin. She very much kind of kicks his ass, and he is sort of sent away with his tail between his legs. And we understand why that happens, because Catholic orthodoxy is rejecting witches wholesale. The Malleus will change all of that. It takes superstitions and weaponizes them to things that you can punish witches for. The Malleus is a hotbed of misogyny. So women would copulate with demons, midwives would abort fetuses, female sorcerers could steal the penis right off a man. This is the kind of thing that is in the Malleus. and it is now becoming the church's weapon. So from here, more treatises would be written based on the Malleus. There will be a few of these that will be reprinted, but it's arguably one of the most dangerous documents of all time. It really signals this change between the church being very ambivalent about witches and the church suddenly wanting to persecute and allowing people all over Europe to persecute women for things that were basically unproven superstitions. Now from here, the hysteria will spread across Europe. 4/5 of the accused will be women, and it would spread all the way to North America. And so in 1589, when Princess Anne of Denmark's ship finds a storm, there is a perfect setting for a bright and inquisitive young monarch like James to begin the Inquisition and produce his own treatise on the subject. Now, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that it's brought you a sense of kind of where the hysteria of witchcraft really comes from, and how James is able to kind of pick that up and run with it and spread it all the way to North America. Please leave me your comments, please do sub if you haven't already. It really does help a small channel like mine, and I can't wait to see you next week, guys.